Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Gwyl Crime Cymru Festival event, which we're able to bring you through the generous financial support of the Welsh Government. Thank you all so much. I'm Gwynne Jones. I'm the author of the Nathan Sutherland series, which is set in Venice. And in a few minutes, I'll be introducing my fellow panelists, Marsali Taylor and Andy Griffee, as we prepare to investigate Watery Graves. First of all, one of the things the Crime Cymru Collective was set up to do was to promote Welsh crime writing. And so at the beginning of our festival event, we're running 3-minute crime close-up slots, introducing some of our members. And this evening's author is Daniel Aubrey, and I'll allow him to introduce himself. Enjoy the reading. Daniel.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Yes, my name's Daniel Aubrey, and my book Dark Island is going to be out next Thursday. It's my debut novel. I don't even have a copy of it yet to show you, but that is the cover, so it is coming, I promise. It's set in Orkney at midwinter, where human remains are unearthed by a storm on the wild Atlantic coast. And reporter Freya Sinclair has just moved back to the islands, and she becomes embroiled in the story. But every detail she uncovers inadvertently presents a killer with their next victim. So the section I'm going to read is where Freya's just arrived at Bay of Scale in West Mainland, where the bones have been found when something catches her eye. These islands are terrible at keeping their secrets. Nothing in Orkney stays buried forever. Freya already knew that, didn't need the reminder, but she still got one this morning. She stood alone at the top of the steep bank of boulders that protected the dunes, and she watched. She knew she was at a safe distance, a couple 100 meters across the semi-lunar curve of the bay. Not close enough to be seen, too far to hear anything other than the rush of the wind and the roar of a bad-tempered sea. Away to the southeast, a reluctant dawn was leaking into the sky, turning the clouds a greenish grey at the horizon and casting barely enough light to see the people in white paper jumpsuits appearing and disappearing between the mounds in the earth where the Neolithic village lay. Last night's storm had passed, but as she watched a pair of the white figures struggle to put up a small tent, a gust caught on the tarpaulin and threatened to carry them both away. Freya couldn't make out what it was exactly, but through her cheap binoculars she could tell they were trying to cover something that had been unburied at the back of the beach, another secret these islands had failed to keep. She ran her tongue over her dry lips and they tasted of sea salt. She hoisted the hood of a yellow raincoat over her head with her free hand, and with the other she adjusted the focus on her binoculars until the blobs in the field of view grew limbs. She'd grinned when Tom had suggested buying bird-watching binoculars from the tacky gift shop at John O'Groats on the way up here, but she had to admit they were coming in handy. What if we hear a corncrake while we're out walking Luna, he'd said. Or what if we spot a pod of whales off the coast? I'm telling you, we'll be gutted if we didn't buy these things. His inquiry seemed so genuine, his enthusiasm so innocent that Freya hadn't the heart to tell her husband that in all the years she'd lived in Orkney growing up, she'd maybe heard a corncrake once or twice, but she'd never actually seen one. And even if they did, there wasn't a chance in hell they'd get a decent look at it through these piece of shit plastic things. Her phone vibrated in her coat pocket, interrupting her thoughts, and even before she saw the screen, the anxiety she'd fought on the drive over here swelled in her stomach again. But it wasn't the number she'd been expecting. She was almost relieved to see the name Kristin. She thought about answering, long enough to let it ring through to voicemail, then she glanced at the clock above the photo of Tom and their black Labrador Luna on the home screen. It was 8:23. Kristin was no doubt wondering why she hadn't checked in yet, but she would text her back when she got where she was heading. She wasn't quite ready to head there yet, though. Not for another minute or two. She returned the binoculars to her eyes, and instinctively her free hand floated to the piercings in her right ear. She began to pinch them in order, from top to bottom, then back again, counting as she did. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4. The fog in her brain began to clear, and her breathing returned to normal. And that's when she saw it. Thanks very much, Phil. Thank you.
That's great stuff. Thank you so much, Daniel. Something to look out for there. Okay. Hello again. Welcome to Marsali Taylor. Welcome to Andy Griffee. We have a very pan-European panel tonight, which is stretching from Venice to the Netherlands, all the way up to Shetland. Marsali's latest book in a long-running and very successful series is Death at a Shetland Festival, featuring her regular protagonists of Cass Lynch and Gavin McRae. Andy's Tulip Murders. Andy is the master of the Tiller thriller, featuring Jack Johnson and Nina Wilde, who this time are stepping a little bit away from the waterways of England and spending some time on a narrowboat in Holland where nothing can possibly go wrong. Could I ask the two of you briefly to introduce your books to the audience? Marsali, can we start with you? Give us a little background to Cass and to Gavin.
Okay, well, I write what I'd call puzzle-style thrillers set in contemporary Shetland. Cass is a liveaboard sailor owning a small yacht I've kindly lent her my own boat. And her partner, Gavin McCrae, is an Inverness DI who insists on wearing a kilt the whole time for various historical reasons. And they investigate goings-on in and around Shetland, which is more water than it is land.
Very much like the Venetian lagoon, in fact.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, more lagoon than there is solid ground, yes. Andy, can you introduce us to Jack and Nina?
Yes, sure, Phil. So there are 5 books so far in the Johnson and Wilde crime mystery series. Jack Johnson is a journalist by background and profession, like me. I spent 25 years at the BBC before I started writing fiction. And he lives on a narrowboat, a 64-foot stern cruiser. And the nice thing about having a hero on a narrowboat is that he can move all around the canal network, and he does. So the books are set in different parts of the UK, and as you say, the most recent one, book 5, actually has our hero move off to Amsterdam on a holiday with I suppose, the romantic interest in the books, who is a lady called Nina Wilde, an army widow who has her own kind of interesting backstory, and they are joined on their travels by a little border terrier called Eddie, who kind of manages to keep them in trouble, really. So that's the Johnson and Wilde mystery series, as you say, Tiller thrillers.
Tiller thrillers, terrific.
I'd never heard it before.
Well, there is another collective noun for them, which is canal noir, but as there isn't as there isn't too much of it about, I won't claim it as a completely separate genre.
But it's good to be master of it. Yes.
Just on a technical question, Andy, do barges have tillers? Or
Yes.
Wheels?
No, they have tillers. They very definitely have tillers, and a lot of them have these kind of nice little ornaments, brass ornaments that go onto the end of the tiller at the back. So yeah,
I mean, sounds very Venetian, actually. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking about this earlier. I feel a bit of a fraud here because I live in Venice and I do not actually have a boat. As I was explaining to Marsali, our next door neighbour said that currently the bribe to get on the waiting list for a mooring is well over €1,000. So I'm going to need some more books, frankly.
Yeah, well, you're not the only Ford in Marsali's company. I don't own a narrowboat either. I would love to own a narrowboat, but basically I've hired them all my life, and you take them away for a week or a weekend, and had my boating experience that way. And that's mainly because my wife doesn't really like them.
Right.
He calls them. She says, "Why would one want to live in a corridor and go along at 4 miles an hour?" She can, and she's had a couple of holidays with us that haven't been massively successful. So I just have to go along with that.
Now, what I really enjoyed about both of your most recent books, Andy, yours has just come out. Marsali, is yours actually out yet, or is that?
Oh, quite. Nearly.
Nearly, yeah, great. I was lucky to read it ahead of the game. What I really liked about both of them is that I was 3/4 of the way through, and then suddenly both of them took off in a direction where I thought, whoa, no, I did not see that coming. We can't talk about that, spoilers, but I have to say both of those are like, oh my goodness me, I did not see that coming, which was terrific. Andy, I have to say, you have my favourite title of the year in Tulip Murders. Marsali, I think possibly you have my favourite chapter heading of all time, which is "The Death of My Friend is What Afflicts Me," which is a magnificent, frankly magnificent chapter title, because you took all yours from traditional Shetland music, didn't you?
It's not all Shetland, but because the book is set at the folk festival, then I went for fiddle tunes, accordion tunes. Quite a few of them are Shetland, but I did have to go to an absolutely wonderful archive called Traditional Tunes from All Over the Place. Just
Wonderful.
looking for things like Friend and
Mm.
finding suitable titles.
Mm. Is music important to you in terms of what you listen to?
I don't listen as much as I used to because I married a musician, a non-sailing musician, I should mention.
Right. Mhm.
And because he's busy composing quite a lot of the time, then he's quite fussy about keeping the house quiet. So I listen in the car.
And Andy, I mean, Jack Johnson's boat is called Jumping Jack Flash, so music, I guess, is something that's, you know, part of your background as well.
Nothing to the same extent as Marsali. But I suppose I should just explain briefly why it's called Tulip Murders. There's
Oh yeah, please do. Yeah.
So there is a very, very famous tulip that once existed nearly 400 years ago in Amsterdam, and it was called the Semper Augustus tulip, and it was the most beautiful tulip. It was white with red flames going up the sides of it. But as I say, nobody has seen this for 400 years. So why is it relevant to the story? Well, bodies start appearing suspended in the water in a particular type of pose in Amsterdam along the canals, and almost like a floral tombstone by each body is left a single Semper Augustus tulip, even though nobody has seen this tulip. It allegedly died out, as I say, 400 years ago. At the time, a single bulb of this tulip was worth the same amount of money as it cost to buy a substantial house and garden in the middle of Amsterdam. So, you know, lots of puzzlement as to who is committing these murders, yes, but how the heck did this tulip manage to come back to life after all that time? So that's why it's called the Tulip Murders.
Yeah, I did love the way you linked it with a particularly famous painting by Rembrandt, but
Yes.
again, no spoilers on that. Terrific, yeah.
No, it was fun doing the research into the
I bet
whole,
it was. I
you know,
bet it was.
Rembrandt and the tulip mania in Amsterdam and all of that, because I actually wrote that during lockdown.
Right.
So
Right.
I haven't, you know, although I've been to Amsterdam many, many times, I wasn't able to be there when I was actually writing the book. So.
Yeah, good. Marsali, can you tell us something about your relationship with Shetland? Because you were from Edinburgh originally, I believe.
Yes, Musselburgh, I should explain,
Musselburgh,
which is outside Edinburgh.
The honest tune, yeah.
Yeah, the honest tune.
Mm.
And I went up to Shetland as a very new, very green teacher and got a job, went up for a job in the school, which I then taught in until I retired. So I've lived in the same village, in the same house for over 40 years now.
Right.
Well, I'll never become a native. I'm sure that's the same in Wales.
It's very much the same in Venice. Yeah, as you can imagine, I'm sure.
But I think they're actually rather proud of me. And I'm very much involved in, you know, as a teacher, I got to know everybody around me and their grannies and their aunties. And I was almost teaching my third generation when I retired. So I'm part of that sort of mental map of the landscape, if you like. And they're rather proud of me. Published writer, you know, living in our village.
Well, they're a great source of stories because, I mean, I taught English for 10 years in Venice, and one story in particular makes its way into the Venetian game. I mean, what your students a great source of inspiration, stories, background?
Well, not that I can use, unfortunately, because it's too small a place. So I've heard a couple of wonderful stories, which I would love to get Cass investigating, but I just can't, because you can't use real people like that.
It's difficult, isn't it? Yeah.
Particularly as a teacher, where you're in a position of trust. So no, but occasionally, when I've been stuck for a character, I've thought of a child I've known and imagined them grown up. But even that only occasionally, and then I have to change it to make sure that nobody instantly goes, "Oh, that's so and so."
I get asked that quite a lot. Yes. You know, oh, is this so and so? Is this so? Is the tall priest? Etc. No. These people are not real. Yeah. How about you, Andy? Your background with the BBC, was that?
Well, my father was in the army, so I was born in Gibraltar and kind of moved all around the garrison towns of the UK and Germany and Hong Kong and all of those places. But then I eventually settled at a boarding school, an army boarding school. And when I left there, I joined my local newspaper, did my journalism apprenticeship. I did go to university after that, but then I went back to journalism, newspaper journalism, and then I joined the BBC in Bristol as a TV reporter, producer, and then moved to Southampton, Birmingham, where I was head of Pebble Mill, and then finally London for the last 5 years. So I had a 25-year career in the BBC. But all of that time, I just nurtured this boyhood ambition to write fiction, and to write crime fiction, which I've always loved. So I just had my opportunity after a couple of years of consultancy work. And I actually think that, starting to write perhaps a little later in life is actually can be very beneficial. It's you got a whole kind of, a life's worth of experience to draw on. And I found it very hard to write fiction when I was working. There were just too many other pressures, on me at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I was in my late 40s when I started writing my debut. I was 50 when it came out, and I'd felt no real inspiration to write anything before that.
Yeah.
Marsali, how about you? What was your writing journey?
Well, I was trying to find Exhibit A, but going by the spelling, it's a little notebook which I wrote maybe age 6 or so, stories about what we got up to in the Highlands. And I've always written, always. But I know what you mean about that as a working person, working teacher, especially English, which is very heavy on marking. Then the only way I could find time to write was to get up earlier in the mornings. And so I have 5 unpublished books, 6, something like that. I started off with Regency romances due to formative reading of Georgette Hare in my teens, and then moved into crime. So I've got a trilogy of Shetland set crime novels, which I'm hoping someday Headline might be interested in. And it was only really, I went down from full-time teaching to 2 days a week to have more time to write when I got an agent with the original trilogy. And then I was lucky because I got retired early with bowel cancer. I mean, not lucky to get the bowel cancer, but the outcome was that I got retired with actually a better pension than I'd have got if I'd kept going on my 2 days a week. So suddenly I was a woman of leisure and had 5 days a week to be writing, and it's been a book a year since.
That's extraordinary. And your love of the sea, was that always there, or did that come from moving to Shetland?
No, it was always there. I grew up in Musselburgh, which is on the sea, of course, but we had 6 magical weeks every summer in this little cottage in the Highland, which I'll be going back to at the end of May. It was a little keeper's cottage, and you went for miles and miles to the end of a remote road and then got into a little wooden clinker-built rowing boat, which I still have up here in Shetland, and went 1.5 miles to our cottage. No electricity, not even running water at that point. My mum used to carry 2 buckets of water from the burn every day. Washing was in the sea. I think there was an Elson toilet. That was a concession to luxury. And we absolutely loved it. So I was in boats before I could walk. I believe I swam my first length at the age of between 2 and 3. And then I discovered sailing on a school trip, aged 15, and they took us to Loch Earn, and one of the days was dinghy sailing, and I just went, yes, this is me. I love this. So I bought my first boat that was my own boat, in my gap year with my wages in RW First Ace in Princes Street, Edinburgh, which was a 12.5-foot sailing dinghy. So I capsized her all over the Forth for a couple of summers while I was learning, and then capsized her up here, not so often, and had one accident where I nearly drowned, actually. I went out on a slightly too windy day, not out of sight of land, but out of sight of houses, and she went over, and I got her upright, but I couldn't get back in again. She just collapsed. So I discovered that if I sort of clung onto the side with my feet on the centerboard, that she would actually sail. And I still maintain that I'd got my feet on the ground before the salmon boys who didn't have a boat of their own, and they were panicking from a nearby salmon cage before one of them managed to swim the small distance to the shore and get his hand on my forestay. So technically I'd rescued myself. This is important.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah.
But that got me into looking for a bigger boat. So that's when I got my Karima, who is my, well, Cass's boat, really.
Cass's
a little
boat,
yacht.
Yeah. We were talking, offline about the attraction of writing watery thrillers and why is water an inspiration. I mean, the canals in Venice are not actually that deep apart from the Giudecca Canal, but if you fall in and it's cold, it's very, very difficult to get out again. You're trying to claw your way up a mossy canal side. It is very, very difficult. And if it's cold, you haven't got much time to do it. Absolutely. Yeah. Andy, you said you haven't actually got a boat, but obviously you had this interest in narrowboating. And
yeah, and it started quite early. I was 10 or 11, just started at this boarding school, and I was hauled in the middle of the night into the housemaster study, and my best friend was there, and he'd just been told that his mother had died suddenly in Germany. And his dad came over and basically asked if he could take me and my friend away from the school for a couple of weeks in order to just kind of grieve, I suppose. And he hired a boat, and that was my first experience on a canal boat. And it was just three of us on this little wooden boat on the Shropshire Union Canal, and it rained a lot. And I do remember it. I wasn't mature enough to be able to kind of handle their grieving. It was a small boat and it was quite intense, really. And I remember being scared by the big slimy locks as you went down into them, and as we skirted the Midland cities, being quite scared of all the graffiti under the bridges and the barbed wire and the local yobs throwing things at us. So I suppose about 45 years later, when I started thinking about where am I going to set my crime, something unconsciously told me, actually canals are not always beautiful, peaceful, bucolic places. They can be, like anywhere where water is concerned, quite threatening and dangerous places.
I love the way that an idea can just germinate for 40 years and then come out like that. That is fantastic. But Andy, could you tell us a little bit about the canal pusher?
Yeah, well, he was inspired by a real story as well. When I was working in Birmingham, I was responsible for all of the BBC's local radio stations around the country. So I became aware of a story that was coming out of Manchester, and it was that between 2007 and 2010, somebody had clocked that no less than 75 young men had died in Manchester's canals.
Wow.
Which was an extraordinarily high number. I mean, Manchester doesn't have as many canals as Birmingham, say, but the figure for Birmingham was a fifth of that at the time. So that led to a lot of speculation. Sorry, I should say that of those 75, 76 young men who died and whose bodies were found in the canals and the locks, there were coroner's inquests, and in 17 inquests, the coroner had to record an open verdict. Just didn't know how those young men ended up there. So a lot of speculation in the newspapers at the time, Manchester Evening News, that there was this so-called canal pusher prowling the canal system of Manchester at night and pushing unfortunate young men who'd maybe taken a bit too much drink or drugs into their deaths in the deepest locks and all the rest of it. Police at the time said they honestly didn't believe this was true and there was no connection between the unsolved deaths. But it just set me thinking about, well, what if there had been a canal pusher? Then when I came to write my first book, I just remembered that story and transferred the idea of a sociopath prowling the canal network.
That is just very dark.
Transferred that to the Midlands, and then expanded it out of that with, two other kind of significant plot lines in the story. So so that's it was a real story. Well, who knows if it's true, but there's speculation.
It's a quality of a dark urban legend about that, but it is very dark, isn't it? The figure just lurking there, waiting for you to walk by. Yeah. Exactly. Marsali, like myself, you're writing crime in a place which I guess does not get very much crime.
No. 4 murders in the time I've been here.
Right.
And that's not even one every 10 years. We've had 2 murders of young women in the last 3 years, maybe.
Oh, really? Oh.
But before that, none for about 10 years.
Mm. It's a challenge, isn't it? You know, it's
Mm.
making it believable, I guess.
Yes, Anne Cleves and I between us have, I think we've put the murder rate higher than it was in Viking times,
Yeah.
possibly.
Well, I mean, I don't keep a spreadsheet of this because that would be a bit weird, but I've certainly done well over 20 people in Venice. If you add in Donna Leon and David Hewson, you know, Venice is twinned with the Bronx, frankly, but it's yeah, it's something we have to overcome. Yeah, yeah.
But it's
Something.
something that's true of wherever you set your books, because Ian Rankin, there is nothing like those number of murders in Edinburgh. You know, Oxford, murder is a rare crime.
Yeah, yeah. Why do you think we want to read about it so much, though?
I like the puzzles.
Right.
I like the trying to lead the reader off on the wrong path, and then I was very pleased you got that oh moment, because that's what I'm hoping for.
That's terrific when that happens. Yeah, Andy. I mean, you know, and for yourself, I mean, you mentioned you grew up with a love of crime writing. Who were you reading? You know, back in those days, who inspired you? Maybe.
I suppose top of the list, thanks to a particular teacher at my boarding school, was John Buchan. I just read all of the Richard Hannay novels, but especially the 39 Steps. I just love that I read it over and over again. This chase, this endless chase, where he's living on his wits and it's cat and mouse all the time. And I've always been inspired by that. I mean, you know, a lot of his books are not very politically correct these days, but he was a hell of a storyteller. Knew how to keep the pages turning. In fact, I really wanted, when I wrote my first book, to have a chase element to it. And a bit like Richard Hannay, it's hard to make a chase exciting when you can only get 4 miles an hour in an 18-ton boat. But it has to become a cat and mouse chase then, and that's where I tried to kind of recreate to a certain extent in Canal Pushers, the first book. But yeah, John Buchan. I became a grandfather 5 weeks ago, so I can't wait to read Little Cato, Wind in the Willows. You know,
wouldn't that be wonderful?
Messing about on the water still. And staying on the watery theme, I do love Sam Llewellyn. I'm sure Marsala knows very well. I just love his yachting thrillers, and he, like her, you know, is just very, very credible when they're writing about sailing and all matters nautical. You know, it's a bloody dangerous environment, though. A lot more dangerous than canals.
What you get from Buchan, I think, and the 39 Steps in particular, and of course thinking of the Hitchcock film, is when Hannay is out there in the wilds, living on his wits, as you said, but also the sense of landscape, which is, Marsali, I get very much from you from the Shetland books. Was that important to you to make the landscape a feature of it?
Yes. It was almost a crusade, really, when I started, because everybody goes, oh, Shetland, isn't it very bleak? And it's absolutely beautiful. And Shetland on a summer day, there is nowhere lovelier, or not to me anyway. So I was wanting to sell it. I think I've overdone it now because we're getting overrun with tourists. Used to be lovely and quiet in summer. But yeah, and also the other thing you get, and I don't know if you get this from Wales as well, is, but what do you find to do with yourself up there? Well, as you know, if you've lived in the country, there is always something to do. And so I wanted to try in my books to showcase life in Shetland as well, the wonderful facilities we have. My daughter was very young when we came up here, and people said, but what's Marnie going to find to do? Well, apart from just playing around the village with her friends in a big group of 16-year-olds to 6-year-olds, and fishing off the end of the pier and building hussies on the shore and roaming the peat bogs and coming back absolutely muddy to the eyebrows. And she had a little pony and her friend had one, so the pair of them disappeared off for the day. And, you know, kids have a wonderful time here. And my London grandchildren really appreciated that they could just, free roaming, they called it. They could just go out. They met the other kids in the village at the leisure centre, which has sort of children's activities for the entire holidays, and then they just disappeared. We didn't know where they were. They were in somebody's house somewhere being told, "What are you on? Oh, you're Marnie's bairn. Yeah, I was at the school with Marnie. I mind her fine. You have a fair look of her."
I have to say, Marsali, I'm not sure those tourist numbers are going to dip anymore after that.
Wonderful place.
Yeah.
Well, I
Wonderful.
suppose you could.
I was inspired. I was Googling every location as I went through the novel and thought, oh, yeah, I really want to go there. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think as well, as you were saying, our murders are implausible. And one of the things I was thinking about Watery settings, well, it's so easy to kill somebody on board a boat. In fact, one of my difficulties is staying alive on board a boat. And so my murders are actually mostly land murders, just to make it a bit more complex. You know, you hit them on the head with the boom, you throw them overboard, and you sail off and leave them to drown.
I think that's
And shove them off it.
I think that's right, but I do think that having water around in a crime book adds another kind of level of threat and jeopardy, because it's an alien environment, and it is, as you say, so easy to end up, you know, in it.
Yeah. And it's sort of mysterious and sinister looking, and there's a smooth surface and then the depths below, and you think, what's under there? And then you may think your body's gone, but all it takes is for somebody to drop an anchor in the right place and haul it up again, or, you know, a bit of it be washed ashore and then matched with DNA. So you've got that as well.
I think with canals as well, I mean, you've got a history of real crime going back to when they were first being built. They've always had this reputation, I suppose, because they're on the fringe of society and they're kind of remote places. But even when the navvies were building them, they had a hell of a reputation for real crime taking place, and there was a real appetite to read about that crime in the newspapers as well. So, kind of canals have always had that slightly sinister reputation as well. They're sort of hidden places that people drive past and they don't really register, and yet, you know.
Yeah. I mean, in Venice, I suppose there's a feeling that, well, this city should not actually be here. This is insane. You've built a city on an upturned petrified forest and built canals around it. And the one great development of the 20th century, the motor car does not work here. So there's immediately a sort of irreality and unreality to it all. Yeah. And then, of course, Andy, in Tulip Murders, you take Jack out of his regular comfort zone and you stick him in perhaps the other great canalized city of the world, to Amsterdam. So tell us a little bit, what was Amsterdam an obvious choice for you? Or?
It was, I suppose. I just thought it would be nice to get out of the UK for a little bit, and I suppose that may have come because of lockdown, and we were all locked in literally and unable to get out of our houses. So I think I just wanted to kind of spread my wings and go somewhere other than the back garden. And so that's why it appealed, and I just love the whole history of it, and there's so much that's been written about it. But it is as you know, I mean, I think you actually lived and worked there for a while.
I was there back in the 90s, and what I loved about Tulip Murders is that it absolutely catches that contradiction in the Dutch character between liberalism and authoritarianism. It did that, I think, really quite brilliantly. So.
It's a complicated old place, isn't it? And Amsterdam is very different to the rest of the Netherlands as well. It's got and I was writing, I kind of made up the fact that the story was happening in the run up to an election over there, a general election. But actually, it turns out from the most recent election results that it was quite prescient, because the far right now have the largest party in the government, in the parliament over there.
Which is sad, because I don't think we don't like to think of the Dutch like that, but nevertheless, it's there, and I think you confronted that particularly well. But something I want to talk about here, very appropriate, I think, perhaps to Marsali, is the use of language and the use of the Shetland language. I mean, I deal with this writing about Venetians and writing about Italians, and there's always a glossary at the back of the book, which I notice you have as well.
Yes.
How far can you go with the language which is spoken every day, and how much do you have to adapt that for your audience?
Hugely. Partly because my agent is London English, Oxford English. Marsali, what is this twar tree that you are mentioning? So she jumps on me with big boots on if I overdo the Shetland dialect. But also a lot of Shetlanders find it difficult to read. So I do have to anglicize it, I suppose. A word like every, for example, is actually said ivry, I-V-V-E-R-Y, spelt in, but I would just write that every. I think I concentrate more on trying to get the flow of the dialect and the unusual Norse grammar of it. So, for example, they would say, I'm been to the shops instead of I have gone to the shops. And vocabulary, I have an absolute loathing, I have to say, of sticking words in italics all over the place. I'm sorry. I think it just sort of, I don't know, I just didn't like it. Didn't like it, as we would say. So what I've tried to do with, for example, the way Cass's friend Magni speaks, is catch the flow and the kind of rhythm of the language and use dialect words in context so that people can have a guess at it and it's not going to spoil the reading flow.
I think you can do that with a lot of it, actually. Yes, you can think, yes, I can give
so.
some context, which is clever. Yeah.
But I also have a lot of fun with different languages in the book, because Cass, her mother is French, her father is Irish, and she and her mother always speak in French. So when they're speaking, they're both fluent in French, so that's translated as fluent English. But if, for example, Maman is speaking to her father, now I'm sort of assuming that Maman's English is reasonable, but it's not good. So I'm kind of thinking in French in my head, translating literally, allowing for her having done a bit at school. And I also have fun occasionally slinging in a bit of Irish, because she's been married for all these years to Cass's father. So she might, well, where she would say in French, ben, as a kind of starter, she might say sure and, as the father would. Nobody notices but me, but I have a lot of fun doing that. And then Cass is less fluent in Norwegian than she is in French, but still reasonably fluent, but also in some ways more articulate in a foreign language. So she can actually get more personal when she's speaking in French and Norwegian, whereas she's actually quite tongue-tied in English, especially if it's something emotional and she has to take a deep breath and make with the words. So that's fun.
Yeah, good. I'll be switching over to Sarah in about 5 minutes' time, but something I think which is really worth exploring is that we all write in the first person. In my case, it was necessity. I wrote my first chapter in third person. I wrote it second person. I thought, I can't sustain second person over an entire novel. First person was the only one that worked for me. And Andy, you're actually writing first person in the present tense. How did that come about for you?
Well, I just think first person delivers a directness in terms of the conversation that you have with the reader, and I also think that there's a real appeal in effect the reader knowing as much or as little as the narrator, and so that puts them both on the journey that's in parallel. They discover things at the same time, they're surprised by things at the same time, they're and I think it's quite powerful kind of way of writing. But I agree, I was slightly surprised that all three of us were, because I don't think
I had no idea before we started off on this.
I think it's slightly unusual, and I wouldn't say I'm first person kind of 100% of the books. I will occasionally slip into third person or one other character's kind of perspective, but I try to keep that to a minimum so that it doesn't spoil that, as I say, that sort of directness of the conversation that's going on.
How about you, Marsali? What was the experience like when you first put pen to paper? Was first person just something that came naturally, or?
Yes, it does, and it's funny because the previous, certainly the two romance novels, were third person, and then the trilogy is alternately told by an old lady who is a Shetland liver and her great niece who has come up to visit her. So the great niece does a kind of mongoose thing, and I alternated between those two. So I think I'd sort of got into the way of it, and I have a lot of fun with Cass. I also really enjoy the limited narrator thing, because she has her own quirks of character. And so, for example, in one of the earlier books, The Body in the Bracken, she's gone off for she's at the farm in the Highlands where Gavin lives. They've gone off for a ride on stalking ponies, and they find a body, as you do when you go in the Highlands. And she's sort of through the book, she's worrying about, but how could somebody have got the body there? And she doesn't like horses. She's not used to horses. All she knows about them is that they're small. One end bites, the other end kicks, don't share food with them. But there's sort of horses are cropping up. They meet a Njögl, which is a Shetland water horse. There's somebody who's speaking about being keen on horses. And long before her, I think every reader is going, horses, stalking ponies trained to carry dead things. You know, so it's quite fun, and I did play with that more than I usually do in the book that's coming out, The Death to Shetland Festival, because it starts with her finding a diary, which also gave me two viewpoints. So the reader is actually ahead of her because they're finding out things from the diary that Cass only finds out in the next chapter. That was a lot of fun to work out how much information to feed in and where.
That's the thing, isn't it? Yeah.
I would be interested to know whether there's do you guys get the question, well, when your friends are reading it, do they find it hard to detach the narrator from you because they know you so well?
Yes.
I certainly get that all the time from close friends. They just say, well, Jack Johnson is you, isn't he, Andy? Well, I don't think that, but they obviously hear my voice.
I don't think that, but people say to me, oh, well, Nathan is you and Federica is obviously my wife, Caroline, and things like that. And I said, no, I don't read them in my voice or in Caroline's voice. How about you, Marsali? Do you get people think you're Cass?
I do. And I usually sort of retort by pointing out all the ways that Cass is different from me. She's 6 inches smaller and peeved about it. She has dark hair and curls, and she's a much, much better sailor than I am. But I have to admit that the cats are definitely real. This is young Julie coming to.
Hello there. Hello, Marsali's cat.
And definitely Gavin is not Philip, who is an Englishman, my husband, and a determined non-sailor. His mother was Austrian. I put it down to that.
Fair point. Landlocked country. Yeah, I guess. So.
Yeah. It's just not natural to him.
Yeah, but I mean, people say to me, because of Nathan's taste in music, one particular band in particular, the seminal 1970s space rock band, I'm not going to mention their name because of the famous panel we did 2 years ago, which has now become infamous in Crime Cymru history. I won't mention their name.
But should we ever meet in person, I hope you'll tell us in the bar.
Oh, absolutely. Talking of bars, Andy, Jack Johnson enjoys a bit of a drink, doesn't he?
Yeah,
that's
another downside of the first-person narrative, because everybody assumes that I drink as much malt, single malt as Jack. Of course, I'd be dead if I did. I'm secretly hoping that though I might get sponsorship one day from the Scottish whiskey industry for the books.
Well, yes. I mean,
that would be very well.
People wanted my second novel. One review said this guy must have the constitution of James Bond. But
well, it's Venice.
Yes, definitely not approve. Cass would absolutely
Cass is very much
aboard a boat.
No, I think, in my defence, I've met a lot of narrowboat people, narrowboat owners, liverboards, and they're not a particularly abstemious lot, I have to say.
And it was always after the end of the day, once they were tied up. Yes. I did notice that.
Right.
Thank you.
Can you be found drunk in charge of a narrowboat?
I think you can, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, you could do some damage. Yeah.
But I mean, when you see some of the stag parties and the hen parties that have hired a narrowboat, and they've clearly been drinking since breakfast, and they go past you and they're stretched out with cans on, and they're almost bouncing down the canal off people's boats and bridges. Sometimes it's not that funny, actually.
No, I can imagine. Yeah.
Water is a dangerous, dangerous place. It just is, and drink limits your ability to swim.
And locks are particularly dangerous. You fall in a lock when the water's coming in, and you've got a big metal boat banging around. It's a pretty lethal environment. So I try to make sure that they don't drink until after they've moored up.
Yeah, I can't honestly say that Nathan necessarily observes that, but there we go. Yes. Back in the 1970s, if you watched an Italian giallo, the Italian thriller style films from the 1970s, in every film you will notice a bottle of J&B whiskey, because it's almost like a sponsorship deal with J&B whiskey, but nobody has come knocking at my door yet, which I'm disappointed by. Yeah.
Well, for you, it'd be spritzes, surely.
Spritzes, yes. Campari, yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, at this point, I'm going to ask Sarah Todd Taylor if she can come online, and hopefully we've got loads of questions. And if we haven't got loads of questions, Sarah spent the last 45 minutes writing questions. So, hello, Sarah.
I did actually have some questions, but we've had so many that sadly we probably won't get to mine. We've also got some from Wrexham, which is lovely. So to start off, Liz Webb would like to know, do you use exact real places or do you take creative license with elements when useful for the plot?
Well, almost all mine are exact real places. And I have a lot of fun in the planning stage, having a day out in Yell, for example, and actually visiting the places with my notebook and scribbling down things. It's great for inspiration. And checking that, for example, Cass could actually see something from somewhere else, that kind of thing. And I've also done almost all the boat journeys.
Yeah, I'm the same. I really try very hard to make sure that every pub, lock, bridge, feature of the canal is there in reality. And my Bible for all of this is this one. It's called the Canal Companions from J.M. Pearson and Son. And they map the whole of the UK's canal systems 3 miles at a time. And Michael Pearson, who runs the company, makes a meticulous bespoke map for all of my books to go in the front, so that I just love the idea that people can recreate the story, you know, for real, on foot or by boat or by bicycle. I have changed a few things, but only for legal reasons, and I've made that clear where I've done so.
Yeah, I mean, I had to mention that in what I always mention in the back of mine. If I've had to invent a location in the Venetian legacy, I had to invent an entire church in Malamocco, because the alternative was suggesting that this priest was actually collaborating with the mafia. So I had to invent an entire church for that. But yeah, as far as possible, I do like to think you could eat and drink and walk your way around Venice.
Yeah, in my third book, Oxford Blues, I had an old college barge where various naughty things were happening. And I went and tracked down the barge and the owners of the barge. I said, do you mind if I put it in the book? And they said, no, we don't mind. I said, well, some quite dodgy things are happening on board. And they said, we don't mind. But they said, could you just move it? Because we don't want people coming to find us and rubbernecking or whatever. So I invented a bridge farther down the River Isis and sighted the boat there because of that reason, you know. But 99% of it is actually there and in place.
Yes, for that same reason, some of the houses are invented, and particularly Cass and Gavin's cottage, which I'm sorry to say is still a ruin.
Oh, wonderful. We've got a question from Sian in Wrexham. She would like to know more about how each of you structures your plots. Do you map them out in detail beforehand, or do they more develop organically as you go along?
Shall I go first? So with Canal Pushers, first book I'd ever written, first bit of fiction I'd ever written, and I just had three plot ideas in my head and the main characters and the setting, and I just wrote the first word and carried on writing. And I didn't know how the hell it was going to finish, and I got completely lost halfway through trying to work out how I was going to bring these three plots elegantly together by the end. And so I really, you know, made it up as I went along. But then the publishers said, we'll only give you a contract if you prove that you've got a second Tiller thriller in you featuring Jack and Nina. So give us an outline of the second book. So I did a chapter by chapter outline of the second book, knew exactly what was going to happen in each chapter. And I wrote it in half the time of the first book. And so I've evolved really, from being the classic pantster who writes by the seat of their pants to the plotter who plots it all out, to somebody who actually plots it all out now, but also trusts his imagination a bit more when who's writing the book. That's how I approach it.
I'm kind of the opposite. My first book, Death on a Shetland Longship, was really carefully planned, round twists and sort of changing. It's half of it's told in flashback. Cass is being monosyllabic at the inspector who is asking her questions, Gavin, and then thinks what actually happened. So she's kind of jumping back to the present. So I had a lot of fun with that. And I've gradually got less and less planning as I've gone on. So I start with an idea and I start thinking about, for example, in the second book, Cass gets locked in a Neolithic tomb. And that started because I was in the wonderful Maze Howe in Orkney. And I thought, I'd hate to be locked up in here overnight. You feel the weight of the centuries pressing down on you. And then I thought, Cass would hate to be locked up in here. And then I had to start thinking, well, how did she get in there? Why is she in there? Why is somebody shut her in there? How's she going to get out with having to go out to call the cavalry? Janie, you don't need to be a star for this one.
Oh.
Off you go. It's not Dreamy's time. Sorry, I shouldn't have said the word. It's not time yet. So that kind of that's the way I usually start, with an initial idea, and then I start asking questions, and I start sort of building up an idea of what I want the characters to do. And then I have to start thinking, well, what sort of person would do that? And at the same time, I'm thinking about what time of year is it? And therefore, what events in the Shetland calendar can I work in for Cass to overhear conversations or meet people or see two people meeting or all that kind of thing. And then I start thinking, where can I take it and do my meeting? So I've got a notebook full of ideas and places before I actually start writing. And then I find the writing almost not quite does itself, I wish, but is easier.
And I suppose that the nice thing about being able to write like that is that if you don't really know what's going to be in the next chapter, then there's a good chance the reader doesn't either.
Yes.
And so there's that constant element of surprise, which is...
Yeah, I mean, I've normally got an ending in mind, but I mean, I normally end up writing endings about a third of the way through, because about a third of the way through, if I'm stuck, I think, let's write the ending, and I can give me something to work towards. But with The Angels of Venice, I wrote 4 endings for that because I thought there were 4 possible solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And I genuinely didn't know who had done it, because there were 4 convincing solutions that would finish that book, and I genuinely didn't know who had done it. So I went for, going to have to write all of these, and then I went with the one which felt the most emotionally satisfying. But it's nice when you get to that point and you think, okay, doesn't have to go the way I was thinking. You know, those moments are rather lovely when they happen. Yeah,
definitely.
Yes, I think by the time I get to the end, I'm beginning to feel that the murderer is so obvious that there's a couple I've changed it in.
That's the thing. I think we all think that, but of course, there's no reason why the reader who has not been spending 9 months in our heads is necessarily going to think that. Yeah.
And I did read about one writer. I'm sure I'm not making this up, but she writes her book backwards. So she writes the last chapter first, and then the penultimate chapter next, and all the way through to the... I can't get my head around how you would do that.
I heard that. I love the idea of doing it. I'm not sure I would trust myself to do that, but it's...
Not a question, but Verena Rose would just like to send a special hello to Marsali because she said you are the best tour guide ever.
Thank you, Verena.
I love this question from Alex Hawley, and it's probably quite a quick one. He says, have you ever written a character who can't swim?
Yes, actually. The most recent book, but that's a slight spoiler.
Andy, any swimmers in yours?
Yes.
Not from memory, no. But yeah, I mean, in most instances, if you fall in the canal, you can stand up. You know, unless there's a sociopath trying to force you under the water with a fishing net. So it's kind of less of an issue for me, I suppose, than if you're out at sea.
I haven't drowned many people. There was one in Venetian Gothic, but then again, it was falling in the middle of winter late at night and not being able to get out. And so it would have been the cold that would have got him. That's a great question. Yeah, I'll have to go through them all now and saying, yeah, swimmer or non-swimmer. Yes.
The old seamen used to deliberately not learn to swim because they said it would just prolong the agony.
Whoa.
They'd just drown quickly than have to sort of die of cold and
Exhaustion, yeah.
And I don't know whether you know this story, but
Yeah.
if you're born with a cowl over your head, which is
yes.
you're born with a placenta over your head, then there's an old sailor's belief, I think, that you're protected from drowning for the rest of your life. And old sailors would actually buy the placenta in a jar. It was actually valuable to them because if they had that, they believed they wouldn't be able to drown as well.
Wow.
Apparently 1 in 10,000 births, it happens.
Mm-hmm.
Not a lot of people know that.
No, we don't know. We do
Comes
know.
up in Shakespeare somewhere.
That's right.
I
And
think the witches have the call of a babe.
yeah, and in Dickens, in Great Expectations, Pip who's born like that. So
Right. Yeah.
Winnie would like to know, can any of you imagine ever wanting a break from your current protagonists to start a new series?
Hello, Winnie. Well, I'm actually, Nathan Book 8 comes out in July, and then we're taking a short break for a year because next year we're off to Sicily with a new series. And so we're going to alternate Venice and we're going to alternate Sicily for a few years. I wouldn't abandon Nathan. I owe him far too much for that. I enjoy spending time in his company. And I get lots of lovely messages from people, which I never expected when I started writing, and that's a great privilege. And so I would never abandon him. But for a couple of years at least, we're going to mix and match Venice, Sicily, and Venice, Sicily.
Well, I get a break from Cass in the summer because I try to write through the winter, get my book in sort of end of May, and then I have the summer to go sailing in. So I can pretend to be her for a bit, but at least I don't have to argue with her about the difference between what I would like her to do and what she's deciding to do for herself.
I'm in two minds at the moment. I don't have a plot. Unusually, this book has come out, the last one, and I don't have something buzzing around in my head as a plot. So for me, then it's about the setting, and if I go to the place, the plots start to emerge. And I've got two in mind, I'm afraid. One is the canal that goes through the Brecon Beacons in Wales, which is completely cut off and separate from the rest of the network. And I think I've heard it's a very, very beautiful canal. So I may try to persuade my wife that we need a fortnight's research holiday over there. And then the other thing is, if I stay abroad, if people do like the Amsterdam setting for Jack and Nina, then maybe it makes sense to visit your home turf, Phil, and get them going to Venice.
We've got a spare room, but bookings are filling up. So, get in touch.
You've managed to answer one of the other questions, which was whether there was going to be a murder mystery on the Brecon and Monmouthshire Canal. So.
There you go. If there's the demand out there.
Well.
So.
Is that the one that goes through a lovely high aqueduct? Yeah.
Okay,
there's the Pontyskillet, which is farther north. That's the famous one that needs quite a bit of money spent on it at the moment.
Right.
Not sure.
The ability to swim will not help you if you're falling from there.
No.
127 feet high.
Phil, do we have time for one more? Or
if we're very quick, hopefully.
If we're very quick. Noel would also like to know, how do you ensure that the police and legal procedures are accurate?
In my case, I was dead lucky, and I had a student who worked for the Guardia di Finanza who gave me all sorts of brilliant information about procedurals and in particular about art theft. So I was just very, very lucky with people I've taught.
Well, I've gone on various courses for forensics and eyewitnesses and that sort of thing, which all appear in the books. But just recently, then the police decided to have a cuppa with a copper, and they set up camp in various local halls. So I went along and looked like a little old lady, and I think they were expecting me to worry about I don't know, keeping the windows locked properly. So I fixed them with my beady eye and said, "No, I'm a crime novelist, Marsali Taylor. You might have heard of me." And they had. Amazing. And I wanted to ask you about the drugs scene in the Isles. I think I livened up their morning. There were home bakes.
Yeah, and I have a wonderful group of beta readers who are specialists. Well, one is a GP who specialises in forensics pathology. One is an ex-policeman. 3 of them live on board narrowboats, and they tell me if I've got it wrong and a canal boat is going uphill rather than downhill and that kind of thing. So I rely on them, and they're very generous with their time and their feedback. But at the end of the day, my hero is a journalist rather than a policeman, and I think that means I can go and get away with it a little bit more. But it does mean that he cuts corners in the way that the police can't, and that sets up a certain amount of tension in the book between the authorities and Jack. So yeah, I think tension is a good backdrop to crime fiction. So that's why I also like setting them on canals, because most people on canals hate each other. People who own the boats hate the hire boaters, and they all hate the fishermen, and the cyclists hate the dog walkers, and all these people that use canals. Actually, there's a lot of tension on canals. They're not very peaceful, despite what the Canal Owners Trust tell you.
Okay, well, I think that's possibly all we've got time for, which is a great shame. We could have gone on for much longer, I'm sure. Thank you, Sarah, for monitoring the YouTube channel. Thank you to everybody who's watching. If we didn't get around to your questions, I'm so sorry, but there's so much we could have talked about. And thank you, of course, Marsali and Andy. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Fun. Thank you.